Hey folks, in this episode we talk about terrain and how this affects our hunting, fishing, and outdoor adventures. Terrain can have so many differences, elevation changes or thick brush or flat areas, as well as different water depths while fishing. These can have a great effect on the animals we are trying to track down.
That's right. Look out for how we try to use terrain to our advantage as we head outdoors in chase of our prey. And on that note, please make sure to follow us on Instagram and subscribe to the podcast. That's the best way to stay up to date with all of the material that we're dropping.
All right, thanks for giving us a listen, and without further delay, let's get into the episode. Welcome to the East Coast Hunt, Fish, Hike podcast. I'm Pat Carroll, hunter, fisherman, and general outdoor enthusiast. Join me and my brother Mike as we share tactics, recount stories, and plan our upcoming outdoor adventures. Welcome to the East Coast Hunt, Fish, Hike podcast, your home for stories and tactics in the woods and on the water. I'm Pat Carroll, and I'm joined, as always, by my brother and co-host, Mike. How's it going, Mike?
I'm good. I'm tired, but I'm good.
Very good. Today we're going to be talking about terrain. Basically, how that terrain can affect our hunting and fishing adventures, and even some other kind of outdoor adventures, whether it's like skiing or snowboarding or hiking, stuff like that. Terrain obviously plays a big impact on a lot of things you do outside. So we're going to get into some of the strategy that goes along with how we're dealing with the terrain, whether that be the elevation or potentially thick brush. We're going to discuss a little bit about how that can affect the animals or the critters that we're ultimately chasing or trying to track down, and as well as how that affects how we're going to be behaving in the outdoors, whether it's going to be how we're dressed or what we need to think about as we're starting some of these adventures. So yeah, pretty excited to talk about some of those things today. But before we get into it, I'm going to push our social media a little bit. So please follow us on Instagram. We do have an Instagram handle. That handle is at ec_huntfishhike_pod. So give us a follow there, and also rate and review. Please tell us how we're doing, because ultimately that's the best way to move us up the charts and to extend our reach to more listeners. We want to reach as many people as we can, tell our stories, give you guys some of the strategies that we're using in order to track down some of these critters. But we'd love to hear how we're doing, what you guys want to hear more of, and things that we can do better, because ultimately that's going to make this podcast even better. So that's what we're thinking about over here. Mike,
Yeah,
anything to add on that?
yeah. Subscribe too. Subscribe to us. That way you don't miss any of the content that we're putting out. If you subscribe, you'll be able to uh, get the most up to date listening to our podcasts right as they're coming out. You won't miss an episode. You won't miss any of our conversations or anything like that. So make sure to subscribe if you like what it is that we're chatting about, and then communicate with us too. Send us some messages if you want for us to cover a topic that we're not talking about, or maybe you experience something similar in the woods or similar with one of your outdoor adventures, or you want for us to look at a different topic, or kind of revisit a topic, and kind of take a look at it in a different way. These are all the types of feedback that we can certainly help cater to what it is that you want to hear. Because we're here ultimately for you guys, and we love doing this, and hopefully being able to get some more people involved and kind of hearing what it is that you guys want to hear, and hearing some of those stories. We've got stories galore, so we're excited to kind of hear from you guys too. So for sure, subscribe so that you don't miss any of the stuff that we're putting out there, and communicate with us. Let us know. Send us a message on Instagram, and we'll get back to you guys, and we like to hear from you guys. So
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we have no shortage of stories, but at the same time, if you guys are looking for something in particular that may give us the added oomph that we need in order to get out there and try something new, or try something that we haven't tried before, and then talk about it to you guys. So that's
yeah,
an added bonus for us as well.
yeah. Absolutely. If you've got any like lures that that would diversify my tackle box too, particularly for you southern fishers that are out there that are fishing on the Chattahoochee. This is just a side note, a little tangent here, but I'm looking for more lures. So hit up the hit up the messages there, hit up the direct messages, and let me know what lures you're using specifically on the Chattahoochee because I'm hopefully going to be getting out there pretty soon, and I'd love some advice and I'd love some help. So.
I suspect you mean differing lures, not necessarily a quantity of additional
Yes,
lures.
yes. I mean, if you want to ship them my way, I mean that's an option too. No, I'm kidding. Yes, different variety of lures. Because well, as I'll get into the podcast today, I lose a lot of lures too due to the terrain. So either one of them would fit. Uh, but but no, in all seriousness, yeah, subscribe and send us some messages, communicate with us, because we want to hear from you guys.
Yeah, very good. All right, so we're going to get into a little bit of outdoor stuff that we've been doing, some of our recent outdoor endeavors. Now, personally, I haven't really gotten outside as much as I'd like. Work's been busy, kids been busy, but we are planning on doing a little family hike this weekend. We're going to take a little drive up to southern Maine and hike one of the it's called a mountain. It's not really a mountain. It's kind of more of a hill, but there are some hiking paths, and it's a good time. With the little ones, it's probably only about a half mile to 3/4 of a mile up, but it's good to get the little ones trying to hike up that. It gives them a little bit of confidence. They're actually able to do a lot of the hiking on there before they get tired and actually get to the top and be able to kind of look around and see and have a nice view, which is super nice. The other added benefit to this particular hike is that there's like a road that goes also to the top. So we can hike to the top, and then usually what happens is my wife says, why don't you just hike back down and grab the car? So then I go do a quick little solo hike down to get the car, drive it back up, and pick up the family, which is
There you
ultimately
go.
pretty convenient for everybody. It gets the kids out of there before they start losing steam or getting frustrated with having to
Yeah.
hike back down, and also gets us out of there a little bit sooner, which is nice. But another thing that we like to do when we're in that kind of southern Maine area is that there's a brewery in the area, and it's called the Batson River Brewery. Shout out to Batson River Brewery, but they have a nice little spot called Fish Camp, and it's like this nice restaurant, and it's like has a lot of like seafood dishes, but also like a lot of like your standard fare too. They have like burgers and stuff like that. Actually had a venison tostada there the other day that was very, very good.
Whoa, very nice.
Yeah, but it's a great little spot. They got lots of obviously like fish on the wall. It's kind of decorated like it would be like an old school fish camp and stuff like that. So the vibe is right up my alley. They got really good beer
Yeah.
there too, which is great. So we may, if I can convince the fam, we may stop there for lunch as well, which would be just wonderful.
No, that sounds awesome. Take lots of pictures, both of the hike and also
Oh
of
yeah,
that
definitely.
fish
That
camp
that
restaurant.
spot's
That
got
sounds awesome.
yeah, the place is pretty great. But Mike, what have you been getting up to outside?
Yeah, so for like strictly outside, we're kind of in the like the storm season here down in Georgia, where pretty much every afternoon, or certainly it feels like every afternoon, we have these like thunderstorms that come through and roll through. And I think I mentioned previously on one of these episodes that down here in Georgia, it's very different than up north where it rains, and up north it gets cool again. Well,
Mm-hmm.
down here it rains and the humidity is such that it actually gets like hotter. So we've been kind of trying to make our way through and around and avoiding some of these storms. Now, my 3-year-old loves the storms, loves the rain, loves splashing in puddles. But we're trying to kind of like time our walks, and we've got these like a nice neighborhood that we're living in, so we've got these kind of like walks that we do kind of around this big kind of like hour long circle that we end up doing, and we're always kind of like looking up at the clouds to make sure that we're not going to get totally rained out.
Mm-hmm.
But we've been doing some walks, and we've been continuing kind of the work in the garden and in the backyard. My 3-year-old planted like a little flower garden in the kind of like nook area behind the screened-in porch that I'm sitting in right now.
Very nice.
We ended up like planting some grass, which meant that we needed to fertilize. And I looked up a lot of things on YouTube. I learned a lot about fescue grass,
Oh.
and how to at least attempt to plant it. And we're starting to now see, after about like maybe a week and a half or so, a little bit of some sprouting that's going on with our grass, which is
Ooh.
very exciting. And the flower garden is starting to sprout a little bit too. We're seeing some flowers that are starting to materialize in the garden too. So
Wow.
so the outdoors has it's been kind of limited to the fenced in area of our backyard in some degree, but we're starting to see some of that hard work paying off. And we're really grateful to do that. It's kind of fun with the whole family,
Yeah.
being able to see some of that stuff starting to grow. But the other thing that I've been doing these last couple of weeks through the school that I teach at, I do run like a swim camp. Now this is an indoor pool; it's not an outdoor pool, but it's kind of like outdoor adjacent because we're doing lots of activities and lots of games and lots of swimming and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a lot of fun, and the this is the second year that I've run the camp, and it's certainly a source of a lot of stress and sleepless nights. But it's I'm kind of reminded now I'm into the second week of it, and the kids are having a blast, and
Mm-hmm.
the coaches are doing a really excellent job of kind of running things in an organized way, in an organized fashion. And so I know that it's not strictly outdoors, but running this camp, it takes a lot, and I'm starting to see some of that paying off too. So so it's been some outdoor adjacent stuff, but it's been good. It's been active,
Yeah.
which has been nice for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I commend your outdoor gardening and plant growing because I have like no green thumb whatsoever. So
Listen,
everything I
Pat, I
plant
don't
dies.
either. I don't either. I really don't. But I'm trying and I'm learning, and YouTube is a great asset for things like that.
I'll give you an
And
example. We went to the wholesale club. We went to BJ's the other week, and I was like, we sometimes have like a little herb garden on the outside of our back deck. I was like, oh, what we need is some basil. So I got like the basil plant that was hanging out outside of BJ's, and put it in the soil, and got it all situated out there because we have a little flower pot out there that we use for this. And I came back at 1 week and it was literally dead. Not a single green leaf was on that plant. I don't know
oh
what happened.
no,
I don't know if some sort of like fungus or something attacked the plant somehow, but for whatever
oh
reason,
no.
the entire plant was dead within a week. So that's just an example of how poor my green thumb really is.
Yeah, well, sometimes you just get a bad plant.
Well,
Sometimes you just get you just get a bad plant. But yeah, it's been. I don't have a very good green thumb, but I want to learn. I think that it's more the product of I get to the end of the school year, and being a teacher and being a coach, like I get kind of antsy, and I
hmm
look around and I see these projects, and I'm decent enough with my hands, like I'm a decent enough handyman, and so I get like anxious and antsy, and I see these projects that I wanna kind of like bring
hmm
into fruition, and so like 7 or 8 trips to Home Depot later, I've got something that's starting to kind of resemble a little bit more of what it is that I want for it to look like. And I'll definitely like run out of gas and peter out like in like a week and a half.
hmm
Like well, once I'm about like 3 weeks into the summer, it's like, all right, things are hot, and we're well into summer mode at that point. But I'm still kind of in that still inspired part. So. But yeah, it's been good to kind of get the backyard a little bit closer to where it is that ultimately I'd love for it to be.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right, so without further ado, let's get into some terrain and how that affects, our outside adventures, right?
Yeah.
So, I kind of broke this up into a couple different categories, right? So the first one is going to be kind of like elevation, and then followed by like brush. I think brush is kind of something that we all kind of have to deal with in one way or another when we're outside. And then water. So whether that's like a
Hmm.
river or like kind of marshy or even like lake, or in, when we're talking about fishing, obviously there's various types of water that come into play there, right? So those are kind
Yeah.
of, where we're going with this, the trajectory of this podcast here, right? So I figure we could start with elevation, and I kind of roped in like terrain features too, because I feel like that is kind of plays along with elevation, right? So first, I'll give you kind of a lowdown on the general terrain features that I'm like looking at when I'm looking at a map, right? So this
Yep.
usually, when I'm dealing with the terrain in a hunting scenario, the first thing I'm going to look at is like the topographical map, right? So that's going to give me a good idea of A, what the terrain looks like, and B, how the places I'm going to pinpoint as potential areas to kind of track down those deer, right? And the areas I'm hunting are a little tricky when it comes to the topographical maps, right? So obviously you look at some place like the White Mountains, right? And these topographical maps are, you can see lots of lines, right? Those are dictating all these different elevation changes and, how these mountains that are getting huge, stuff like that, right? But when you're in like a, smaller area that's kind of a little bit more like suburban, these
Hmm.
changes in elevation are not nearly as high, right? So a change in elevation in the White Mountains could be hundreds of feet. A change
Right.
like in the areas that I'm hunting could be like 10 feet, and sometimes those
Yeah.
things don't like appear on the map, or they're really difficult to see, which can make it a little bit challenging, right? But
Mhm.
a few of these features that we're looking for, the first one would be like pinches or funnels. So these are areas that basically the terrain is moving in a way that it makes kind of like a valley, right? And it's
Okay.
it's pinching it's pinching the activity down to a specific point where if a
Right.
deer was going to get from like point A to point B, there's something either like elevation gain or like trees and stuff in the way that's going to funnel them into one specific area, right? And that's beneficial because if you can key in on these funnels, then that's an area that the deer are more likely to be, right? Just from
Yep.
from the fact that
Oh.
they're not going to want to have to go over the hill. They're going to go
Yep.
through that
Hmm.
funneled area instead, because it's going to be easier for them to walk, right?
Yep. Hmm. And that's a higher concentration, I would imagine, too,
Exactly.
where if you're hunting this whole forest and you can identify a location where there's going to be less forest and more deer, that
Hmm.
concentration makes it easier for you to be able to hunt. I'll get into something really similar to that in just a little bit when we're talking about fishing. But that kind of like funneling aspect, when you can locate those spots, you've kind of hit a gold mine, because you take what would otherwise be an entire forest, I would imagine, that you're
Hmm.
hunting, and you're now like severely truncating that, so that you know that any animal, any deer that's trying to get from point A to point B is going to need to cross by this path in order to do so. And so you like exponentially give yourself better odds of being able to see deer.
Yeah, absolutely. And
I would imagine.
yeah,
Yeah.
no, for sure. And it's exactly what's happening, right? And you may not, ultimately what you're doing is you're increasing the odds of you seeing a deer, right? I mean, they may still choose to walk in the harder terrain and go over the hill, right? But
Hmm.
let's say 9 deer out of 10 are more likely to go through that funneled area, right? Which is just increasing your odds of potentially seeing a deer, right? So
Yeah.
that's kind of where the logic on that goes. The next thing is benches, right? So benches are huge, are keys to watching, to what the deer are going to be doing on hills, right? So a bench is like, if you imagine a hill, right, like relatively steep, you're going up, and then let's say halfway up on that hill there's like a flat point, right? And it kind of goes along the side of the hill, so it's like steep, and then it like levels off to like a flat table or a bench there, and then it keeps
Yeah.
going up again, right?
Hmm.
That's a bench. And deer love using these benches for a number of different reasons. One, they can potentially sleep on them. They can lay there, which is beneficial to them because they can catch the wind coming over the top of the hill, right? And they can see down under the bottom of the hill, basically keeping them safe from both sides, which is hugely beneficial to them. They'll also, what they'll do is they'll walk along these benches sometimes. Sometimes they'll walk on what some people call the military crest. So this is about 2/3 up the hill, right? And if there's a bench that runs about 2/3 up the hill, Basically, what will happen is the wind can come over the top of the hill. The deer can see and or smell from the other side of the hill, and it basically makes it so that deer can see all the way around it, making it really challenging to catch that deer. But at the same time, if you can key in on those areas where that military crest is or expect the deer to be there, it's hugely beneficial for you as the hunter because you have that advantage of expecting to see them there,
Yeah.
right?
That makes sense.
And in additional to that, we also have saddles. So saddles are these points on the hill, right? If you imagine, let's say, two hills that are right next to each other, the lowest point between them, right, would be a saddle, right? So it kind of looks like if you could imagine a
A
saddle,
riding
a
saddle.
riding saddle, exactly where it's like high on one point, high on the other, but there's like kind of this dip in the middle. That would be the
Hmm.
saddle. And if a deer is trying to get from one side of the hill to the other side of the hill, instead, what they'll do is they'll walk around, right? Because obviously they have no elevation gain to do that. But other times, if they're going to have to cross over that hill, using that saddle is the least elevation gain that they're going to have to experience, right? So it's
Hmm.
beneficial for them to utilize that. And sometimes, very similar to a pinch or a funnel, it's going to be moving all that deer activity into that same area as well, which
Which
is
almost seems kind of ironic because I would imagine that they're doing these things in order to keep themselves in, like, not in a visible area or not in an area that they're going to be in danger. And yet, by kind of manipulating some of this terrain, you're actually taking what they're doing in order to keep themselves safe and kind of using that to your advantage to put them in your goal very much danger, right?
yes.
So being able to kind of the like use what it is, because I would imagine that these deer wouldn't want to be kind of like putting themselves like right, and you've talked about this a number of times, Pat, when it comes to like being at an advantage or at a disadvantage in terms of whether they're walking into the wind or not walking into
Hmm.
the wind. Kind of similarly, I would imagine that they wouldn't want to put themselves in like a broad open spot of like at the peak top of a hill where
Hmm.
they're very visible and able to be picked off by predators, right?
Yes.
So I think that it strikes me as kind of ironic because they're going through these measures in order to try and keep themselves safe. But if you know that and you can manipulate that, all of a sudden you can put them into a great state of danger.
Yes, exactly. And that's exactly what you're trying to do, right? So the deer are using these terrain features, trying to use these terrain features to their advantage, right? They're trying to act in the way that is going to keep them the safest that they possibly can, right? Because I imagine they're a prey animal, right?
Right.
Everything in their mind, everything is out to get them, even though, that may not be the case. They
Hmm.
still are acting as though everything is out to get them, right? So, I mean, if we were in the woods and somebody was hunting us, right? How would we be behaving? Would we be walking out in the open, but in the middle of everything, or would we be, sticking to the brush and the cover for most of
Yep.
our day,
Mhm.
right? I mean, I think we know the answer there, right? Sticking to the cover and making sure that we aren't able to be easily seen is obviously going to
Yeah.
would be
Hmm.
keeping us safer, right? The deer are
Yeah.
doing exactly the same thing. So it's how do we use that or manipulate that in a way that's going to increase the hunter's odds in order to see them, right? So that's those are kind of the ideas with a lot of these terrain features. The deer use them to maintain their safety, so the hunter can key in on these areas and then use them in order to pinpoint where the deer are more likely to be, which is ultimately what I try and do when I'm looking at a new piece of terrain or even the terrain that I utilize. Micro changes between one thing or another may make the difference in seeing a deer or potentially not seeing a deer, which
Yeah,
is which is great.
absolutely. That makes sense.
Um, and then as far as how I prepare for elevation or differences between one hunting area or another, one big thing would be like proper footwear. So if I'm going to be doing a lot of hiking or a lot of walking, elevation or not, I'll usually use a different pair of boots than if I'm going to be just kind of hopping in a tree stand and not doing anything, right? So I have one pair of hunting boots that I use for hiking. They're a little bit thinner. They're a little bit more like a hiking boot. And I have a different pair of hunting boots that I use if I'm sitting in a tree stand, right? So those ones are like much more insulated. They're not really used for walking. They have a much bigger sole, but they keep my feet warmer, which is a, a huge
Yeah.
advantage in that regard. If I heard I could use them for walking around, but if I did, my feet would get super hot and probably get sweaty.
Yeah.
Which then again, right, the more we sweat, the more the deer smell us, the least less likely it is that we're gonna see those deer.
Yeah.
And the same thing goes for, walking through a lot of this terrain too, right? If I'm going to be out there hiking up extended elevation, right? Like, hundreds of feet, I'm going to want to make sure that I'm not wearing too much clothing, right? Because if I'm doing all that moving, I'm going to sweat, I'm going to get hot, and then I'm gonna be smelling, and the deer are gonna smell me, and I'm not gonna see as many deer, right? So, that's pretty much how
Yeah.
that goes. Now,
No, no, that definitely makes sense.
moving into how the deer are going to use the terrain. I mean, we kind of already covered that, right? A lot of these terrain features are how the deer are going to use them, right? They're going to use those pinches and funnels because it's the shortest distance or the less challenging distance between 2 points. The saddles they're going to use to maintain a good area on that hill where they can see and smell everything around them, and the saddles are going to be used as they move over the top of the hill, to one, so that it's the area or the point of least resistance, right? It's going to be easiest for the deer to walk right over that hill. And two, as you're coming to a top of a hill, this goes for hunters and deer. There's a point in which the person or the animal starts to crest the hill, and the kind of what can happen is the sun can be behind them, and you can get like
Mm.
skylined, right? So if you're a hunter and you're coming to the top of a hill, you have to kind of be careful to make sure that you're not like giving your profile right away as you stand up to the top, because what can happen is the deer can see that profile as you're walking over the top of that hill. The same thing can kind of happen for deer, and the deer are going to try and avoid that as best they can as well. So as the deer is walking to the top, they're going to try and avoid getting skylined as well, but for the exact same reason. They don't want that predator to see them with the light behind them, because then it makes them an easier prey, easier for somebody to key in on them and potentially, track them down and kill them, which is ultimately what the deer is trying to avoid, right?
Yeah, it's almost kind of like they're silhouetted, and
Exactly.
in doing so, anything that doesn't seem natural is going to end up being something that's either going to spook the deer in the case of being a hunter that's kind of silhouetted on the horizon, and then the deer doesn't want to be silhouetted because that's going to make put them in a position that they're being noticed by predators. So,
Yes.
that totally makes sense. As you're talking, Pat, I keep thinking that it is a different world when it comes to the fish,
Mm-hmm.
because, and I mean that on two levels. It is quite literally a different world that the fish are experiencing in terms of their elevation than what it is that I'm experiencing on the top of the water. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, for the most part, when you're out there, at least for lake fishing, the water is, I mean, you're talking about like altitude or like elevation zero, like
Mm-hmm.
it's flat. But the elevation that I'll get into later on in a later section, and how it is that the fish are kind of are using this elevation to their advantage, or to their, in some instances, to their disadvantage. That's kind of where you can start to try and manipulate their elevation. But
Mm-hmm.
it's not the same. Like in the instance of hunting, the hunter and the deer are experiencing the same elevation, and so
Yeah.
manipulating it in the same sense for the hunter as it is for the deer. When it comes to for fishing, that's not exactly the case,
Mm-hmm.
because you're trying to you're not trying to deal with the same type of elevation that the fish is dealing with. The fish has a totally different world, a different universe, a different kind of like terrain and elevation that they're trying to maneuver through under the water, that everything is flat on the surface, so
Yeah.
so I just find that so
For
interesting.
sure. No,
And
I
then
gotta I gotta imagine, right? Like a deer, obviously it's more challenging for a deer or a person, right, to hike up a hill. For a
Mhm.
fish, like swimming up is not the same as like climbing up a hill, right? I
Right,
mean, it
they're
doesn't
just
really
swimming,
matter quite as
yeah.
much. They're just swimming, whether it's up or down. For the most part, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, now there are things that they're doing in order to try to avoid being eaten, and
Mm-hmm.
there's lots of things that they're doing in order to try to eat successfully. And so there's manipulation that you can do of that. But in terms of like in terms of the actual strain, you're right, Pat. You're not looking for, in the case of deer, you're looking for like, all right, what's going to be easiest for the deer? How can I manipulate it, and how can I use to my advantage what's going to be easier for the deer? There's no real like using terrain to find what's easier for the fish, because the fish are just swimming.
Hmm.
Now that there are instances of currents, and that there are instances of kind of like paths and and those kind of avenues of least resistance. There are still aspects of that, but it's severely limited when it comes to fish, because ultimately they're swimming.
Hmm.
They're not putting in more effort as they're trying to climb higher elevation, and so there are things that you can manipulate in terms of the deer's terrain and elevation that you can't really do when it comes to fish.
Hmm.
But I just find those kind of like intersections of those differences so fascinating.
Yeah, for sure. Um, as we move into, some of these other aspects of what the deer are doing in the woods, right? One aspect is wind, right? So deer are going to try, as we discussed previously, right? Deer are going to try and have that wind to their advantage most times. And they'll also travel these terrain areas in a way that's going to try and keep that wind in their advantage as well. A lot of that has to do with where they are on the hill, right? So a lot of the times they'll be set up on the leeward side. So that's the side of the hill that is not getting the wind directly onto it, but it allows those deer to be able to smell the entire other side of the hill, right? Which is hugely advantage. Which is a huge advantage for them.
Yeah.
In addition to that, right, there are these other things that are called thermals. So basically, as the sun heats up the land, right, that warm air rises, right, and so if you're looking at a hill and it's on the sunny side of the hill, the air is gonna start traveling up that hill, right. What happens is that the deer can use these thermals as to their advantage, right? So they know that specific areas of the land are going to heat up faster than other. So they'll walk in an area that's going to pick up that thermal rise, that air current as the sun
Mhm.
comes up, to make sure that so they can smell an area that they may not be able to. So and this may be, in some instances, right, the wind can be coming from one direction, the thermal current can be coming from another, and that deer can actually have the wind coming from both sides, being able to smell basically everything around it.
Oh
So
my
these are
gosh.
so these are some of the things that we need to think about as we walk the terrain, as we think about which side of the hill is going to be getting the sun, and how that air is going to heat up on a sunny day versus potentially a cloudy day, right? So that can play a role in if you're going to hunt an area in not only the weather conditions, right? Is it warm? Is it cold? But also, is it sunny? Is it cloudy? Because that can change what the deer are going to be doing in any specific area at any given time, right?
That is insanity. That is it's so I mean, you're absolutely right, and it's just science. And Pat, I can tell that this is like your sweet spot in
I
terms
know.
of being able to kind of like nerd out about the
Mm-hmm.
like the different sciences behind why it is that these are the things, and how it is that it ends up manifesting with your ability to be able to use that to your advantage in hunting.
Yep.
But the man, it is right into the we are in the nitty gritty here. We're talking about the thermal currents
Yes.
and how those can be used to our advantage. I love it. It's awesome.
No, and
I'm learning so much, Pat.
it's wild too because I've seen on more than one occasion like specific areas being active due to not necessarily the temperature, not necessarily the time of day, but if it's like a day that has a lot of sun or not, right? Or if it's a day that's particularly cloudy.
Yeah.
Those are gonna those can significantly impact if the deer are gonna use that area or not based on what the terrain is doing and what the thermals are doing. And also, right? So we talk about thermals, right? So the sun warms up that air, it causes an upward current of that air, allowing the deer to smell it. However, if the wind is strong enough, it can actually counteract those thermals, right? So even though the sun is warming up that air and driving that current up, if the wind is too strong, it can actually blow it back down, negating those thermals and thus changing what the deer are going to do that day. And the deer can pick up on these
Oh
things
my
too. They
gosh.
understand that the wind is strong enough that it's going to blow those thermals down, and the deer is going to walk a different path that day than they would a different day, right? So these are some of the ways that the deer are using and they do it naturally, right? It's not like they're thinking, oh, the thermals are going to be high today, we should walk on this particular particular route versus this one. They just know. It's a natural thing for them, kind of like when we wake up on a cloudy, rainy day and we're groggy, right? It's the same type of deal.
Yeah.
They just do it naturally, which is
First of all,
wild.
one, I love your deer voice, Pat. That was excellent. But two, I'm kind of reminded when it comes to fishing of kind of a similar. It's a very different phenomenon. Just like looking at what it is that like warm weather or warm temperatures can end up doing to the fish, because ultimately like warm weather and like a stretch of really warm weather can actually help with fishing.
Mm,
It can get the fish to be quite a bit more active than they otherwise would be. The warm weather kind of like excites the fish. It can speed up their metabolism. It makes them more active. It makes them feed more. And so like the warm weather oftentimes can really help with that. But then if it gets too warm, oftentimes they can become lethargic. So it's
mm-hmm.
kind of like finding that sweet spot in there where you can kind of use it to your advantage, because it can be really helpful. But then all of a sudden, if it crosses that threshold into being too warm, sometimes the fish can get lethargic for that, for all the reasons that they were once very active. If it kind of crosses that point, they can become lethargic, and then they're not feeding as much. So like there are still aspects that you can do with temperature and with thermals and stuff like that, but it's a different world when it comes to fishing.
Yeah, for sure. But as far as fish and how they use like terrain or like I guess underwater terrain, what are some of the differences between how the fish are using that versus like what deer are doing generally?
Yeah, so for me, I try to use, and I'm not great at it, but I want to be better at kind of like manipulating elevation and manipulating terrain. I try to do it a lot,
Mm-hmm.
um, and I try to kind of use what it is that I can see on the outside of the water when I'm not down like actually in the lake. I try to use some of the clues and things that I can see with the terrain that's surrounding the lake, in order to be able to help me with what it is that could be going on under the surface, to put
Mm-hmm.
myself in a position to be able to catch more fish. I say this especially because of the fact that I do as much trolling in a kayak as I do. It's
Mm-hmm.
how I do most of my fishing, not necessarily trolling, but I'm oftentimes in a kayak. And so I'm either casting and retrieving towards the shore, where you can have a little bit of a sense of what that underwater is going to be looking like,
Mm-hmm.
as you're casting towards a coast or towards the shore, and you can sometimes try to use that to your advantage as well. So it's an aspect, the kind of the natural aspect, that I do struggle with, admittedly.
Mm-hmm.
But the underwater terrain again is very different than what it is that you're seeing on the surface, and so it does end up having an enormous impact on the fish, because the water that they're swimming through is the same like consistency,
Mm-hmm.
from one part of the lake to the next. It's all water.
Yeah.
Uh, but the terrain and what it is that they're coming across, it is one of the biggest impacts on the fish, and thus it's one of the places that you can manipulate it the most. And so when you're looking at kind of like elevation, or what we would call in fishing depth,
Mm-hmm.
you can really use that to your advantage, especially when it comes to feeding grounds. And so what I'm talking about there are kind of like these transitions, these spots. Sometimes they're along the coast. If you can find one that's along the coast, that's awesome, because
Mm-hmm.
now you can kind of like cast and retrieve into it. But you're looking for these transitions from like deeper water up into these either like plateaus, or sometimes if you're along the coast, right up into the land. And the reason that that's so helpful is for the same reason that we were talking about those funnels, Pat, when it comes to deer,
Mm-hmm.
because you're concentrating the fish into a smaller volume, not
Mm-hmm.
just a smaller area. We're not just talking about kind of like the surface, but because we're talking about a lake, we're talking about volume, right?
Yeah.
And so these fish, if you're fishing an entire lake that's 30 feet deep, well, there is a tremendous amount of space that you could be catching these fish, and you need to put yourself in where the fish are.
Mm-hmm.
If you're fishing where the fish aren't, you're not going to catch any fish. And so if you can find a spot where that transitions from being in these kind of like deeper lake areas into being into like all of a sudden it's coming and climbing up at a very steep altitude, or at kind of like a very steep rate,
Mm-hmm.
up to 5, 6 feet, well, now you've increased your odds.
Mm-hmm.
Just like you're talking about with that funnel, now you've funneled these fish in terms of the volume of the lake. You've funneled them right up against this hill. And you know that because you have a brain and you know that there's less volume in these kind of like smushed areas as
Mm-hmm.
you're coming across these hills. But the fish know that too.
Yeah.
And so the fish always use this in terms of where it is that they're feeding. They want to feed in these same areas where I want to fish. And so it ends up certainly helping the fisher, but it also helps the fish too, because as they're coming across when they're feeding, they're trying to kind of like trap fish just like I'm trying to trap fish.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're trying to, as they're chasing these fish, the fish that they're chasing is running out of places for them to go until they ultimately get eaten by this fish. And it's part of the reason why you see so often these fish that are in like the active feeding times in like the like 6 o'clock hour, the 6:15, sometimes even as late as like 6:30. You see a lot of fish jumping. Well, that's
Mm-hmm.
because these fish are coming across these feeding areas that are getting they've got less and less of an area for them to go, and so these fish, as they're coming up into less and less depth, they're kind of like chasing these fish up, and then they end up striking up at the surface. Often, sometimes you get some kind of like bugs and some kind of like surface dwellers that they're
Mm-hmm.
that they're striking at on the surface of the water too. Don't get me wrong, but oftentimes it's right in these kind of like feeding areas, and you'll see them all along kind of like a rim,
Mm-hmm.
where you're getting a lot of like very very active fish as they're kind of like chasing these fish up steeper and steeper elevation until they run out of room, and that's when the fish ends up striking.
Yeah.
And so you see some fish that end up kind of like clearing the water, and it's a marvel to see, and it's wonderful to see, because now you know that you're in a feeding area,
Mm-hmm.
and there are fish there, and so it's
Right.
very exciting to be able to see stuff like that, and it's why fishermen are always kind of like on the lookout for stuff like that.
Yeah,
Uh,
so do you use any sort of like depth charts or anything like that when you're looking at like a lake or an area that you're potentially fishing?
Yeah. So yes and no. I should do that sometimes. Yes. Sometimes if my father-in-law and I are going to go out and fish like a new part of, let's say, Lake Hartwell, which is
Mm-hmm.
a lake that we're less familiar with.
Right.
Um, and we're looking for some places of elevation like that. We'll sometimes get the maps out and chart it out, and take a look for some of those areas where it's like, ooh, look at this. We got like a 50 square foot kind of like plateau here that
Mm-hmm.
on all other sides drops off to like 35 feet. That
Mm-hmm.
looks like a really great spot. Let's go ahead and see if we can find ourselves some good fishing in those areas. You are benefited by safety signs when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
fishing, because oftentimes out on these lakes, the lakes need to notify the boats of areas that are of these kind of like more shallow areas. Five,
Mm-hmm.
6 feet. The boats need to know this,
Yeah.
because now all of a sudden, if we get to a low point in the lake, now what was 5, 6 feet is now looking at 1, 2 feet,
Mm-hmm.
and you're scraping your boats, you're running your boat aground, right?
Yeah.
So the you can use some of those signs if you know what it is that you're
Mm-hmm.
looking for. You can use some of those signs to be like, ooh, there's a nice little 50 square foot plateau there where I can catch some fish, because the rest of this lake is at 30 feet, and I got myself a nice little plateau there. That's where I'm going to go and fish. And so you can kind of like use charts to your advantage. You can use signs to your advantage.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to talk a little bit about this in terms of like the preparation. One thing that you can use is a fish finder.
Oh yeah.
And so I wish, I mean, there are other devices that you can use too, which are just like depth finders.
Mm-hmm.
And I almost use that more with my fish finder than I do um, any like actual looking for fish that are
Mm-hmm.
on there, because the water can get so, especially after like a storm or something like that, if there's debris and stuff that's
Mm-hmm.
that's in the water, it can be really difficult for the fish finder to actually distinguish fish.
Mm-hmm.
uh, but it's very good at being able to find the depth. And so you can find some areas of you can kind of be paddling along or in your boat and know that, ooh, we're in like 25 feet right now.
Hmm.
We're in like 30 feet right now. Or, oh wow, I was just in 25 feet and now I'm in 10 feet. This might be a nice little feeding area that I might be able to. No wonder I'm seeing these fish jumping
Yeah.
out of the water. This must be a pretty good feeding area for them. So using fish finders in terms of depth and for terrain can be really, really helpful. It can also tell you where on the terrain the fish are typically feeding.
Hmm.
And so if you encounter an area that's kind of like either along kind of an upward grade, or you find yourself on one of those plateaus, or typically it would be less in a plateau, but more so if you find yourself kind of like fishing in kind of like a little like deeper pool, or finding yourself fishing in like 25 or 30 feet, and yet you know that there are fish that are actually at 15 feet. Well, I'm not going to be using I'm not going to be using like a surface lure if my fish are, unless I see them striking the surface.
Hmm.
I want a lure that's going to be a little bit of a deeper diver if it's going to be getting down there to that like 15 or 20 feet. Because when it comes to fishing, you got to put your lure where the fish are.
Hmm.
And if you're off by just a couple of feet, you're not catching a fish.
Yeah.
So being able to know where, in terms of the depth that is that they're feeding, is half the battle. You can know all of the terrain like the back of your hand, but if you don't know where the fish are on that terrain, you don't. It doesn't do you any good.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy because you think about like hunting, right? Obviously, if you're gun hunting, right, you got to get within like let's say I don't know, a couple hundred yards of a deer. If you're bow hunting, you need to get within let's say 30 or 40 yards max, right? I mean, I
Yeah,
don't know if I would have a 40-yard shot with the terrain that I'm dealing with, but that's max. But like fishing, right? You're talking like inches, right? I mean, if you're
yeah,
not getting
uh-huh,
that lure right by where the fish is,
yeah.
you're not going to catch that fish, which
Yeah,
is
you
pretty
could be
crazy.
off by a exactly. You could be off by a foot and a half, and now
Mhm.
all of a sudden you're not catching that fish, and it can be challenging and it can be frustrating for sure. But when it comes to kind of like looking out at the shore, I think that's kind of what it is that I'm looking for. So if you put yourself kind of like in the kayak with me, that's kind of what it is that I'm looking for. Are these really kind of like steep areas that are coming down to kind of like a point. And so if you look at what that's doing to the volume around that point on all areas, you've got this kind of like increasing odds and this concentration of fish. And that's where that's kind of what I'm looking for. These kind of like steep drop offs that's what it is that it's doing on the surface. That's what it is that
Mhm.
it's doing out of the water. And so you can pretty much assume that that's going to be what it's going to continue to do as it makes its way further and further down into the lake, because it's these natural hills
Mhm.
that are surrounding these lakes anyway. So being able to kind of find where you can get kind of like a larger volume of concentration of fish, that's where I have found probably the most success in trying to manipulate the terrain, is being able to find these points that end up being these feeding grounds. And then when you get out there early enough to be able to see the fish jumping, it kind of reaffirms, oh yeah, so I was right in kind of like noticing that this would be a
Mhm.
good spot. But there are times that the out of the water doesn't do what it is that I want for it to do. And there are times that like I can put myself in a spot where I'm so sure based off of what I'm seeing out of the water that I should be catching fish. And then when you're not, again, you're not seeing any sign, you're not seeing any fish jumping, and it's just like, what am I doing wrong?
Mhm.
And sometimes, just as you're saying, Pat, just veering a couple of feet past where that really awesome feeding ground is, especially when you're on the surface of the water and you're kind of you're an agent of the tides and you're
Mhm.
you're you're kind of being pushed forward and back. You can find yourself in kind of no man's land.
Yeah.
And when you're in no man's land with no reason to catch fish, you're certainly not going to catch any fish. And so like reaching that balance can be really hard. But there's an example that I always think of, kind of like across the way. It's a little bit more of an extended paddle
Mhm.
from the lake house. It's on Lake Kiwi. It's where my father-in-law really likes to fish early in the morning. Now, I would need to get up probably another 30 or 45 minutes earlier. I'd
Mhm.
be I'd be getting up at like 5:15 to be able to paddle out to get out there for 6 o'clock if I'm
Mhm.
not taking the boat. And so it's less frequent of a spot for me. But if you can get out there, there's kind of like this largemouth point that kind of it's kind of like a peninsula,
Mm-hmm.
and all along this peninsula, my father-in-law really likes hitting it with these whopper ploppers early in the morning, because you'll get these really awesome surface strikes with some big largemouth bass, which of course are so territorial,
Mm-hmm.
that they'll kind of like linger along this peninsula and some of the rocks and stuff that are there, and then they'll strike at these whopper ploppers, which are pretty much for the most part surface and kind of like gathering the attention of the fish, and but there's this rim that kind of like goes around this peninsula, and so even if you're not getting there super early, you can always see sign of fish that are kind of like jumping around this peninsula, because it's almost like, if you can envision kind of like a ring,
Mm-hmm.
like the ring of fire in the, I think it's in like the Pacific Ocean, right? That's made up of all of these like volcanoes. It's kind of like a similar thing on a
Yeah.
much smaller scale, in Lake Kiwi, and so you can kind of like, you can see where it's like this peak, and it kind of
Mm-hmm.
like follows around all the way around this peninsula, and you can be finding fish that are jumping all over this rim, and but if they're not jumping right where it is that you're fishing, it can be very challenging. And there was one time, I think that this was just either last summer or the summer before, where there was a boat that was kind of like positioned right along the rim, and they just hit the right balance. And my father-in-law was convinced that it's because of the bait that they were using, and so he went out the next day and got these like white herring lures,
Mm-hmm.
that to kind of like resemble these white herring that he was that this other boat was catching all these fish with. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm convinced that it's just because they were in the right spot in terms of that elevation. They just manipulated the terrain. They were, whether it was with a depth finder or with a fish finder, they were able to put themselves where the fish were jumping before they were jumping,
Mm-hmm.
and they were bringing in 5 6 fish while we were picking up none. And so and he went out and got the right lure and went back out there that next day and didn't catch anything, because the fish weren't at that right point in terms of the elevation. And so I think that it kind of just is testament to the fact that you got to have that right balance and find the right lore. But it's not always about the lore, right? I think
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's equally about that, putting yourself where the fish are. And you can do a lot of work with the elevation, but it's also probably the source of the most frustration, because you can be just right around the bend from somebody that's doing exactly what you're doing, and
Mm-hmm.
manipulating the exact same location with the exact same rationale for the exact same reason, and they caught 7 fish and you caught none. So
Yep.
it can be quite frustrating in that sense.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's both, right? I think for the most part, and this is what I've seen in fishing, sometimes in hunting as well. It's like the fish or the deer are gonna do what they're gonna do, right? And the best way to increase your odds is going to be in the area where they are ahead of when they're going to be there, right? But you can use something like a really authentic lure, or something like a deer scent or something, to pull them a little bit further over, right? So it's
Yeah.
if when you can do both at the same time, that's when you're going to see probably your best results, would be what I
Uh-huh.
would think.
Yeah, absolutely.
But moving from terrain into brush. Now, obviously, brush does play a lot with terrain as well. But I know I've personally had some challenges with brush, with finding new spots or getting into spots in the dark. Certainly can be challenging for me. Um, some of the ways that I deal with that is, one, scoping out those areas ahead of time, right? So going in during the daylight and trying to figure out what path I'm going to use in order to get to a specific area, if I know that it's like heavily brushed, right?
Yeah.
You know, that would allows you to get in there easier the next time. It allows you to not get super frustrated and lost in the thick stuff. I've done it enough times, bushwhacking through thick vines and thick brush in the dark.
Uh-huh.
It's frustrating. It's loud. So I try to avoid it as best I can,
Yeah.
by kind of mapping that out ahead of time. Usually I'll use one of the mapping apps, right? I'll basically walk in with the mapping app on. It basically draws a line where I walk, and then I'll be able to
Okay.
reference that line the next time. when it's dark to make sure that I'm not
There you go.
walking through all that brush. Um, Most of the time it works pretty well. Sometimes, with the brush, it's funny because even if you're, a foot or two off to the side, it could be a totally, completely different game as far as where you're walking, right?
Yeah.
Some of these paths are really narrow. They're, either deer trails or other animal trails, right? So they're not necessarily meant for, it's not like a walking path. It's just like a little avenue through that brush. So
Yeah.
sometimes, the mapping it out beforehand helps, but sometimes it's not it's not as easy as it might seem.
Yeah.
Um, I've done this multiple times, bushwhacking through the brush in order to set up a stand. In one instance, I got so frustrated that I just stopped and just waited for it to get light out before I set up my stand because I was like, I am just in the
Yeah.
middle of this brush. Like I know basically where I am, but I'm not going to be able to find the tree that I need to right now. So I'm just going to stop. I'm going to
Right.
wait for it to get light, and then I'm going to find a tree.
There you go.
Which, sometimes that's your best option, right? Instead of making additional noise, calling more attention to you, just to set up your stand late and not be there in time anyway,
Yep.
saving yourself the
Mhm.
frustration and the noise and sending your scent all over the place by just waiting for
Yeah.
the light to come up. Sometimes it's additional benefit there too, right?
Yeah, and when deer are so good at being able to pick up on what it is that's natural, what it is that's unnatural, those scents, those sounds, I think that you kind of do yourself a little bit of a favor of being a little bit more patient in that regard, right?
Yeah.
And both fishing and hunting are sports that require patience,
Hmm.
and the you have to be patient in order to be successful in fishing and in hunting. And I think that that's kind of one of those moments where, out of maybe it might have even just been out of frustration, but I think that it kind of like forced you into that patience, which is always a lesson that I always keep coming back to when it comes to fishing, is that like you got to be patient, and it's
Hmm.
so humbling sometimes, and that strikes me as one of those humbling patience stories.
Yeah, no, for sure. And the thing that's funny with brush is that, like, yeah, it's frustrating to get through all that to get to where you need to be, but the deer love brush. Like the
Yeah.
deer are always going to be in the thickest, nastiest spot that they can be cuz it's easy. It's not as hard for them to walk through that as it is for us to walk through that. Even watching,
Yeah.
a deer with like a big rack walk through really thick brush, they like that rack is an extension of their head. They know exactly what that's going to feel like as they're walking through that brush, and they can walk right through it easily. And it's kind of amazing to see, to be perfectly honest, when you see that happening. But deer love
Well,
that thick cover.
what is so cool about that? I mean, it kind of brings us back to that conversation that we were talking about before, with like the silhouetting on the top of the hill and doing what it is that they can do in order to keep themselves safe. But just think about how a deer is like biologically like made. Don't think about how a deer is biologically made, but like think about how it is that their bodies are structured, right? They have these long legs. They're able to kind
Mhm.
of like gallop and run it, like essentially through this brush.
Mhm.
And so what it is that these deer are doing is they're using like their bodies to their advantage. They are
Yes.
in the advantage in the brush like that. And that goes not just for hunters, that goes for coyotes, that goes for other foes. Like
Mhm.
what it is that they're able to use to their best advantage are these long legs that allows for them to clear this brush, that their adversaries, that the things that are hunting them down, be it a hunter or be it a coyote or be it some other animal, they're not able to do that as easily as deer is, just because of the way that they are shaped, like
Yes.
literally the shape of a deer. And so you kind of it's like you got to give them some props, you got to give them some respect for being able to be able to kind of like use that to their advantage. It's kind of like natural selection almost.
Yeah.
It's exactly what it is. It's
Mhm.
natural selection that they're able to kind of use this to their advantage, and they're using their bodies in a way that others can't. And so, as frustrating as it is, Pat, I can kind of see what it is that you're saying, that the brush is something that they're going to be putting themselves in more often than not. So you got to kind of accept that and
Oh
and
yeah.
learn how to hunt in the brush, because
Yes.
that's where they're going to be.
Exactly. That's exactly the case. And the other thing about, deer being in the brush, right? If a deer is sitting in the brush, it is really easy for them to see out of the brush and see anything that's coming at it, right? And it's really challenging for anything outside of the brush to look into that brush and see a deer, mostly because of all the shadows and stuff that any of those sticks and branches and stuff are casting on the bottom portion of that brush, right? You look at at like a thick,
Mm.
area with a high stick count, and all you see is like the sticks and stuff on the outside. You can't really see into that, right? But if
Right.
you're sitting inside of that, it's really easy for the deer to see out and see any predators that are going to be coming their way, which gives them a massive advantage over you. So the key, right, if you're trying to figure this out, right, is to know that the deer is likely going to be in that brush, right? So how do you approach it in a way that that deer isn't going to see you, and also using things like trail camera data or just your general knowledge of the area. Where do you think that deer is going to leave the brush, and when do you think they're going to do that? And if you can set yourself up in a situation where you're right on the edge of that brush, you've gotten there at a time where the deer didn't see you, and you know when they're going to leave. That's when you can really start seeing some success of when those deers are going to be leaving, which is pretty
All
cool.
right, now I'm gonna make what is gonna be far and beyond, I think, the strangest comparison that we've ever made on this show. And so
I'm
get ready for
excited
it,
for
Pat.
this one.
But just wait. If you've ever been like going to the bathroom in like a bathroom stall, if you know like in like using the toilet in like a
Mm-hmm.
bathroom stall, whether it's at like a sporting event or in
Mm-hmm.
like a public area, um, uh, if you've ever been like in the stall using the bathroom, you can kind of sometimes see, because you're so close to kind of like that closed door, like a little bit of a crack that's in between kind of like where the lock sets
Mm-hmm.
and where the door is. Now, for the people that are on the outside of that stall, they wouldn't be able to see as well inside of the stall.
Mm-hmm.
However, those that are sitting inside the stall, you can kind of like see pretty much the entire bathroom that's on the outside of that stall through that very small sliver. Now, I'm imagining kind of a similar effect going on with these deer, that as they're in the brush, it's
Mm-hmm.
very difficult for them to be seen. AKA, when you're in the stall, it's very difficult for you to be seen. You're pretty much invisible to anybody
Right.
that's on the outside the stall. But they can see through those little cracks, and they can kind of manipulate kind of the cracks and the openings that are in this brush to be able to see the entire forest, aka bathroom, that's on the other side of that stall door, I mean brush. And so there you have it. That's got to be the strangest comparison that I've ever made on this show. But I think that there's something to that, right? That they're kind of putting themselves in that bathroom stall so that they can be protected, but then also kind of visible of what it is that's on the outside. So there it is.
that,
That's the strangest comparison
that
that I've
is
done
an odd
on the show. So
that is an oddly accurate comparison, Mike. It was
right, I like to think so. I'm gonna
it
give
does
myself credit for that
a
one.
little bit strange, but yes, picking up pretty much exactly what the deer are doing in that brush. So I commend you on that
Yep.
analogy there. Uh,
Yep.
but Mike,
And
as
I now apologize to our listeners who are going to be trying to hunt deer in the brush and are now going to be thinking about them kind of like cooped up in a bathroom stall.
That's pretty good. But Mike, as far as brush and fishing, how does that impact your fishing and how you're going about selecting your spots when you're fishing on the lake?
A lot, a great deal, especially because of the type of fishing that I'm doing. I'm doing so much casting and retrieving, and I'm doing so much trolling along kind of like the edge of the water. Very rarely am I out in the middle of the lake, unless there's like a very specific location that I'm trying to get to, or unless I'm trolling across from one point to the other. I'm very rarely in like the middle of the lake. I'm almost always kind of like in striking distance to one of the edges, or trying to
Mm-hmm.
troll along the edge in order to try and increase my odds. That same conversation about the volume and the lake volume, I'm always trying to kind of like put myself in a place where, if my lure is in a spot of high concentration, I'm going to be giving myself the best possible odds. When I don't have the distances that I can cross and use to my advantage
Mm-hmm.
in like a power boat. And so the coastal brush ends up being, um, it's a double-edged sword, because it can be very advantageous, but
Mm-hmm.
it can also be a problem. And so one thing, one aspect very naturally are trees.
Mm-hmm.
And the trees can be really good, especially trees that are kind of like overhanging right over the water. We talked in our last episode about that gravity grub that can be something that that particularly some territorial fish like largemouth can really like to kind of set up shop underneath
Mm-hmm.
these trees, especially in some of these watering holes that you can catch some fish. Pat, it's how you were able to catch some fish up on Lake Kiwi with that fake worm. I know we've talked about that episode, that catch in former episodes, but they can also be very very easy as you're casting and retrieving to be able to get your lures stuck in the tree. And so I have caught so many lures in so many trees along Lake Kiwi that I have just straight up lost count. But I do know of one like particular watering hole that has it's almost like an archway, the way that these trees on either side in this like little watering hole, they kind of like
Mm-hmm.
almost cross one another. And the day before I had paddled down, it's maybe like a mile of a paddle from the lake house, and I kind of like paddled down, and I was kind of testing my luck and testing my casting a little bit to try and get it to land like right in between where these two trees kind of like converged.
Mm-hmm.
And doing that the previous day, I caught two largemouth right in where these kind of like trees were is almost kind of like marks the spot.
Yeah.
If I could get the lure like right underneath it, the waters were shallow enough, but there was enough kind of like brush that I was using to my advantage that I could pull the lure through without it getting caught. And I caught two largemouth there the day before, or actually, I think it was a largemouth and a spotted. And so I went back the next day. And I loved that spot. I caught two fish there. I'm going to catch more fish in my mind. Of course, this is what I'm saying to myself. And so the first cast, I sent it out there to try and get it try and get it right in underneath where these trees are kind of crossing, right where it is that they're right underneath this archway. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, it gets caught in the tree that was on the left specifically. And it was my second to last of my Rapala shad lures that I absolutely love. I had one left in my tackle box. I think I had already Frankensteined off one of its like tri hooks that was on the back of it. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
down to like a half of a lure if I don't get this lure back. And so I'm looking at it and I'm like, it's not that high. It's not quite as like I might be able to get myself out of this kayak. And if I can get myself close enough to the side, I can maybe climb this tree and be able to get my lure out because I tried to like rip it down as I always do. And I ended up, I like ripped it right from the line. So the
Mm-hmm.
lure is up there. My fishing pole is down in the boat and so or down in the kayak, and so I'm thinking to myself like if I can just climb up just like 3 branches height, I can get this thing out. And so there I am. I got my scissor pliers like in my teeth, like I'm a pirate, like climbing the rigging. And I get myself out of the kayak, and doing so is very challenging because of course the waves are moving a little bit, and I finally get myself out. Like I get the kayak up beached enough that I don't think that it's going to be and beached is an operative word here. I mean the edges are like higher up than where my kayak is, so I'm
Mm-hmm.
basically needing to do like a pull up and get myself up on the edge here, getting my kayak close enough that I'm convinced that it's not going to end up floating away as I'm trying to get this lure down. Again, I have my pliers in my mouth as a pirate as I'm climbing up the rigging, and I get like up to the tree and I'm pulling myself up and my muscles are like twitching as I'm trying to get myself down here. And so I pull myself up to like the second branch, and the branch like gives this little bit of like a little crack. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, I do not want to end up in the water here needing like I'm not entirely convinced the way that my muscles are like vibrating here as I'm trying to climb up this tree. I'm not altogether convinced that I'm going to be able to get myself back into this kayak. And so I ended up kind of like lowering myself down. And as I do, I rolled my ankle on the uneven
Oh
ground that was
no.
there at my feet. And so I rolled my ankle like right underneath me on a root. And I am like Oh, I don't have to worry about like shouting four-letter words and scaring away the fish because oftentimes they're underneath the surface. I was muttering them, I wasn't screaming them, but I was so angry with my decision to get out of the kayak, and so I ended up kind of like lowering myself back down into the kayak. At this point, I'm like sore, tired, and I ended up cutting my line, so I'm down to like my last half of a lure.
Hmm.
So I end up paddling back, and as I'm doing, I keep scratching my ankle with my other foot as I'm kayaking back. I'm like, gosh, my foot's really itchy here. And of course, I'm worried that it's like a spider or something that I've picked up from trying to climb this tree and trying to get out of the tree. Well, I'm like itching it a little bit. I make my way back. I make my way back through that kind of like mile of a paddle. And sure enough, I look down at my ankle and it's red and it's bumpy. And there was poison ivy at the
Oh
base of that tree that
no.
I rolled my ankle in. So not only did I roll my ankle, but I ended up getting poison ivy on my ankle as I was trying to get my
Oh
lure out of
no.
the tree. And so again, the same exact tree that allowed for me to be able to catch two fish, a largemouth and a spotted the day before, ended up rolling my ankle, losing a lure, and giving me poison ivy the next day. So to say that trees are a double-edged sword, I think certainly this story kind of lends some credence to that. But for me, a lot of the lures that I like using are not great in brush.
Hmm.
And I think that that's kind of the fish doing its job. The fish that are territorial, that are hiding out in these trees, are doing so because they don't want to be eaten, and
Hmm.
so they can kind of in the same deer bathroom stall analogy that we were talking about before. They can put themselves inside of these downed trees that are in the water, and they are protected, and they can see out into what it is that's on the
Hmm.
outskirts. And they can kind of keep themselves protected while at the same time giving themselves very little risk as they make their way a very short distance out in order to be able to get the fish that it is that they're eating. Now, the fish that I'm using for my lures looks a lot like the fish that it is that they're eating, but I have to get my lure so close to these downed trees, to
Hmm.
this brush, that if you don't play your cards exactly right, you end up with your lure in the brush,
Hmm.
in the down tree. And then good luck to you as you're trying to reel that thing through. Good luck to you as you're trying to reel a sinking lure that has a big fat mouth on it that's trying to get it to dive down to like 15, 20 feet as it's trolling. Good luck as you're trying to reel that thing through, not getting it caught in that tree.
Yeah.
It's dollars to donuts. It's gonna get caught in that tree, and so that's what always ends up happening to me. And so it's kind of like that fine line where you're playing with fire,
Hmm.
because if you can get it close enough, chances are there's a fish that's using that tree to its advantage,
Hmm.
just like there's deer that's using this brush to their advantage. But if you don't play it exactly right and you end up casting an extra foot,
Hmm.
you end up losing a lure, and so it can be very challenging in that regard. But beyond like actually losing your lures, uh, as you're trolling through, oftentimes with these deeper lures, it can be very easy to get them caught up. But also, like as you're trolling, you see this less casting and retrieving because every time you're casting, you're only really wasting one retrieval if you end up getting your lure covered in like reeds and stuff.
Hmm.
But let's say you're out paddling in a kayak, and I've seen a lot of success trolling in my kayak. But I've also seen, I'm convinced, times where I could have been catching fish had I brought my lure in. I didn't know that it had reeds that were on it.
Hmm.
You're not going to catch a fish with reeds on your lure.
Hmm.
Just like, I mean, fish are able to sense when something is unnatural. Nothing's more unnatural than a whole like branch of reeds that's kind of like that's covering up a fish. No fish is going to end up hitting something like that. And so I have been like out paddling for sometimes for like 15 minutes or so, and it's like I'm not seeing anything, and there's no activity I should be seeing. Like I should be catching fish here, and then you reel it in, and sure enough, you've wasted 20 minutes because there's been reeds on the
Hmm.
on your nose. And it's always kind of it's always that double-edged sword where you want to be bringing your lure through these lower through these kind of like higher depths. You want to be bringing it through 5, 6 feet, but oftentimes that's right where they're going to be getting their reeds. It's where you're catching fish, but it's also where it is
Yeah.
that you're going to be getting a lot of your reeds. And so you're kind of playing with fire every time that you're doing that. Um, but the uh, but yeah, you're trying to kind of like use that as much as you can to your advantage, and it can be kind of that double-edged sword. And I've lost more lures. It seems as though sometimes it seems as though I've like lost more lures than I've caught fish on some days as I'm trying to try and play with that fire a little bit more. And the less fish I'm catching, the more willing I am to risk it a little bit and to
Hmm.
try and get that lure just a little bit just a little bit closer, but when it comes to these largemouth, like they're so territorial, and you can try and use kind of like new downed trees to your advantage because you can get it nice and close, but then at the same time you're risking losing your lures.
Yeah.
But it's really similar to that conversation that we were having about kind of like manipulating deer trying to stay safe.
Hmm.
These fish are trying to stay safe. They're trying to keep themselves sheltered, and so you gotta kind of lose some lures if you want to end up catching some fish sometimes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, a lot of the same principles apply. The fish are trying to stick to areas that they know are safe, just like the deer are trying to stick to areas that they're safe in. And a lot of those times, it's the brushiest of areas are where those critters are going to be found. So,
Yeah, and it made me think of another story that kind of like a little bit deeper into that spot where there's that overhanging tree. There's another kind of like little pocket that oftentimes I try to like really slowly paddle my way back into. And when it's getting towards the back of this little like canal almost, you're getting to like 1, 2 feet, and my lures tend to dive a lot deeper than that. And so there have been times where I've like cast all the way back, and I get like a nice little cast, and I'll kind of like reel it in a little bit and pull it on the surface in order to try and not get it caught in these reeds. And there was one time that I ended up catching a fish as I was kind of like reeling and trying to keep it on the surface, and I was convinced that I had just got it caught in the brush. And so I gave it like a yank. I'm lucky that I didn't yank too hard,
hmm.
because I it was actually a fish that was on the line, and I was like, oh gosh darn it, I gotta get it out of this brush. And then I can like feel it on the line. It's like, oh damn it, that's actually a fish that's on. And so what I thought was it getting caught on the reeds, and there are some days where I catch nothing but reeds, I catch
Hmm.
nothing but twigs, and so it can feel sometimes like that's what it is. And then uh, this time where I thought that it was brush that I was getting it caught on, it actually was a fish, and so there I end up reeling it in, and I ended up actually catching a fish in that story. So it has a happy ending. But most often it's a twig. Most often it's that brush when you're in that heavily brushed area. But it just goes to show you that that's also where the fish are.
Yeah.
So you got to kind of always be on your guard. And I find myself almost like testing myself as I'm out in the kayak or out in the canoe, being like what would this feel like if it were to be a fish? Like if I were to be casting and retrieving here, like make sure that you like know what it feels like, that it can be that if it is a fish, make sure that you're able to catch it,
Hmm.
because so often you can get into that monotonous kind of like rigmarole of like casting and retrieving and casting
Hmm.
and retrieving. And when I'm in brush, I'm on even a heightened guard to be
Yeah.
like, I'm casting and retrieving, but I got to make sure that I'm not getting it in the brush. And so I'm doing a little bit more to try and kind of like keep myself on my toes, all with the hopes that when I get that strike, I'm able to actually catch the fish.
Yeah, for sure. No, totally get that, and I've experienced a lot of that catching of twigs and brush on my lures as
Yeah.
well. So it's certainly accustomed to that. But the last terrain feature or terrain thing I wanted to discuss a little bit is actually water. So it kind of goes along with kind of goes along with fishing. Um, Me personally, as far as water and hunting goes, I don't usually venture too much into the water. I know, some
Hmm.
people will use things like canoes or kayaks in order to access certain hunting spots. It can be really lucrative in the sense that, obviously a canoe or a kayak is very quiet in the water versus, a hunter traipsing through the woods in order to get to a spot, right? So there's
Yeah.
certainly a sound advantage and and scent advantage there because the water is not going to hold your scent kind of the same way the woods
Yeah.
will. But
Uh-huh.
personally, for me in the areas that I'm hunting, I could potentially get a kayak in there, but it would almost be more challenging to do that than the way that I'm walking in currently. So, not exactly useful for me. I do, however, keep a couple trash bags in my bag, and those are for in case I need to do any like kind of deeper water crossings. So you can use those like larger trash bags, right? Basically step into them as if they were like a pant leg. You can tape around the top of it and then use it as basically like a gaiter in order to allow you to walk through water that's
Yeah.
up, maybe not all the way up to your hip, but at least over your knees without getting your boots, your pants soaked. I've done that a couple times, but usually, try to avoid those deeper water crossings if I can help it. But the deer do use the water, so they'll obviously they live outside, right? So they walk through that water without an issue. They know that a lot of the thicker, brushier areas are right either in the water in a swamp area or right along the edges. So they're going to use that to their advantage all the time. They're going to use that water for drinking because obviously they need water in order to drink and make sure that they can survive. That water is something that they need critically in that regard. And then also that water creates a really good edge, right? So along the water, right, you're going to have a lot of additional brush that can kind of break up the difference from the trees, like the big woods kind of area, to that brushy area. Makes a great edge, and that's a great spot for tracking down those deer as well.
Yeah,
Um,
that makes sense.
the other thing that water is going to do is it's going to affect how air flows. So, if you imagine like a river running down, just like running the way a river would, right? It's going to move the air that's on top of that water kind of like a highway, and it creates another one of those air currents very similar to the thermals, right? So that's going to carry the air along the path of the river the same way that temperature increased air would flow upwards, right? So the deer are going to use this to their advantage. So you'll see a lot of the times that the deer are gonna bed or be in an area where that the wind or the air traveling along the river is going to be to their advantage, right? So maybe the river is running in one direction and the wind's coming from another. If the deer beds in an area that it's at the intersection of those two, the deer can essentially smell everything that's around it without having to worry about the predators coming from multiple directions. So they have
Yeah.
that added wind advantage there, which is hugely beneficial. Um, yeah, which is, I mean, I think it's just super cool. Basically,
Yeah.
those deer are gonna use like not only the normal wind, but also like the water affected wind in order to make sure they always have it in their advantage.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where you can try and use that to your advantage as much as you can. You can try and kind of like manipulate that as much as you can, but then at the same time, like I gotta think that even with that, like even with knowing that, like, all right, there's a good chance that this is going to be where the deer are going to be, as a result of kind of like the terrain. I'm using water to my advantage. I know that they're going to want to be right here because
Mm-hmm.
that's the perfect spot for them. They're in the most heightened place for their advantage to be able to use sense and their ridiculously strong nose to their advantage. But then at the same time, they now are using their ridiculously
Yes,
strong nose to their advantage. So it's
exactly.
so sometimes it's got to be kind of like a balance where it's like, yeah, I know that this is going to be where it is that they're going to be, but I can't really even use it all that much because they're too much
Right.
at the advantage as a result of
Yes.
that. Do you find yourself kind of like playing that like card game almost, or that kind
Mm-hmm.
of like cat and mouse game,
Yes.
but with the deer unknowingly on the deer side, but that like you're kind of like playing this, well, they're at the advantage there and I'm just not even going to try it because they're at too much of the advantage there. Do you see that happening?
Yes, all the time. And then ultimately that's what makes it fun for me, right? Is being able to put these pieces together and say, this is why the deer are in this specific area, right? But then, if you know why they're there, you can try and start to put together when you think you might have just a few percentage points of the advantage back in your favor, right? So, in this instance, right, if the wind's going in one direction and the the river is carrying the air down the river as well, right? That means that these two different avenues with two different, like, quote unquote winds are putting the wind in the advantage for the deer, right? So we know, they know that we know that that's why the deer is there, right? But me, the hunter, may know that on a particular day, that wind may shift, right? So if the wind is predicted to go from, let's say, a north wind to a south wind, and the deer is bedded in that particular area where they have two winds giving them the advantage, let's say in the morning, and that wind shifts, well, now they only have one wind. And it may be
Yeah.
only the wind from the river that's in their advantage, which is potentially the weaker wind, right? So in that situation, right, you can think, well, that deer no longer has the same advantage it had before. That deer may be more likely to move in that situation. And if you can key in that specific detail and be in the area where that deer may be walking in that situation, it puts you in a higher advantage for seeing that deer, right?
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense, and you gotta kind of like, you gotta give it to the deer, right? You
Mm-hmm.
gotta kind of like acknowledge the like their place of advantage and kind of work around that, um, and and kind of try and use what you can as best as you can in order to be able to try and get the deer.
For sure. And the other thing about water and just hunting around water is that also the water is gonna take longer to heat up, but also it's gonna stay warmer longer, right? So we were talking
Yeah,
earlier about those thermals, right? The water is gonna, let's say in the morning, right, is gonna be cooler than potentially the rest of the air or the land around it because it's gonna take longer to heat up, right? So that cold water is gonna suck some of the air towards it, right? So as that warm
yeah,
air is trying to moves into that colder area, right? Likewise, in the afternoons, once the sun goes down and things start to cool down, that water is going to be warmer than the rest of the area around it. In which case, that air near the water is going to evaporate up quicker, drawing more of the scent towards the water in those situations. And sometimes you can take advantage of those things as you're hunting around water as well.
and you know, I'm thinking about it too in the sense of like these deer, as they're drinking water, they need water in order to be
Mm-hmm.
able to drink, in order to be able to live. And the hotter it is, the more likely. I mean, they're just
Yeah.
like us.
Mm-hmm.
It's like when we've got two a days out on the football field in the middle of August or the middle of July.
Mm-hmm.
Like you need a lot more water, and so I'm wondering too if that warmer temperature also creates more of a need for the deer to be going towards that water, whether it's
Yeah.
advantageous for them or not.
Mm-hmm.
At a certain point, they need water in order to be able to survive, and so I wonder the extent. I'm not trying to say that like deer like the colder water, and so you're going to end up finding them like at the creek more often because it's more refreshing. It's more like filtered ice water when it's on a colder when it's on like a colder day or
Mm-hmm.
something like that. But just like biologically, they need water, and so I'm wondering if on those hotter days that might be something that that you see a little bit of an uptick in as a result of that.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, as you said, when it's hot out, the deer need to drink that water for the same reasons that you and I need to drink water when it's hot. They're gonna sweat more. They need that additional hydration factor, right? So being near the water when it's hot is certainly an advantage as well, because it's more likely that the deer are gonna need to move into that area in order to drink. So certainly
Yeah,
something to key on those hot weather days as well.
yeah.
But Mike, as far as like water and terrain, obviously you're fishing, right? So it's all on water. But how does that affect you? Are there any specific things about the water or different water, I don't know, currents, things like that may affect your fishing adventures?
I mean, yeah. I mean, it's water and you're fishing, so there's obviously going to be that kind of overlap, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And um, while you kind of say that almost like tongue in cheek,
Mm-hmm.
it's also like there are elements of that are super important. And so like surface disturbances are like do play quite a bit of a role. Like on a really busy lake day, when boats are out, like are out all over the place, those fish that would otherwise be feeding are no longer going to feel safe feeding. Now, oftentimes this isn't the case when it comes to like the early morning or the later evening. Because the lake isn't as busy at those times, but the like the lake disturbances on really busy days, you'll see that the lake activity, that the fish activity goes way down. Or not necessarily that the fish activity goes down, but it does. It goes down. It goes
Yeah.
quite literally down deeper into the water, because these fish that otherwise might be eating towards the surface, they're gonna be keeping themselves safe down deeper in the water. And so
Mhm.
you're gonna find on those busier lake days that that the type of fishing that I do, trolling through calm waters on a lake on an early morning or in the evening, or casting and retrieving, oftentimes like those busy lake days are not necessarily the best,
Mm.
in terms of being able to keep those surface disturbances low enough that I'm
Yeah.
able to fish. But you can work with some of those other natural factors in order to be able to find yourself a little bit of success. We talked in our last episode about storms and about what it is that that does to the lake.
Mhm.
Another thing that storms do to the lake is it clears out all of those boats, even on a busy like Fourth of July weekend or something like that. It'll clear those boats out of the water, and so now they don't have those disturbances anymore. Now all of a sudden, these fish that they don't care that it's thundering and lightning on the surface. What they do care about, though, is that all those boats that were cruising back and forth on a busy weekend, now they're all gone, and so we
Yeah.
get these fish that start coming back up to the surface. And so if you can be out there even on like a busy holiday weekend, but if you can get out there right in the aftermath of a storm. Now I'm not suggesting that you go out there like during a monsoon, but if you can get yourself out there right in the aftermath of a storm, once it's safe to do so, before the boats end up making their way back,
Mhm.
you can actually have some success with these fish that were lower down in the lake that now want to come back up to the surface. It's feeding time. It wasn't otherwise feeding time, but now even a time that you wouldn't be catching fish,
Mhm.
like 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Now these fish that were deeper in the water, storm comes around, they start making their way up once those boats clear out, and once that water gets just a little bit, sometimes on like a very hot stretch, it cools things down a little bit. We
Mhm.
were talking about how those really hot stretches, we want it to be warm.
Yeah.
Warm is kind of like ideal there, and so might cool it down right into that right spot. And so you can end up kind of getting yourself into this perfect cocktail of a situation
Mhm.
where you can actually end up catching some fish in a time where you otherwise wouldn't. And that actually happened to me. This was probably a couple of years ago. I say that because I was out in the canoe and I wasn't out in the kayak. But I went out, like right in it was during a really busy holiday weekend. I think it was during the Fourth of July weekend, and it was after a storm. And so I gave it a shot at like 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But I tried my like normal spot. And I got out there. Their boats were starting to make their way back in, and so I'm in these swells. I mean, I'm in a canoe and I'm like dipping up and down, and I'm casting into like waves that are up higher than my canoe
Oh
is.
wow.
And so we're like I'm casting into these swells, but they're hitting. And so
Mm.
and it's hard to tell sometimes. The pole's going crazy, the canoe's going crazy, these swells are going crazy, the boats are going crazy, everything's going crazy. But it was in such a position where these fish wanted to be feeding. And so I ended up catching in the midst of these swells. Like I'm telling you, I'm reeling this fish through, and like in these like highs and lows, these peaks and valleys of these waves. It's almost like I'm reeling the fish through the waves as I'm
Mhm.
as I'm like reeling it closer and closer to the canoe. But on this like busy holiday weekend with the waves going like crazy as the boats are coming and swarming back out onto the lake, I ended up catching two beautiful fish, like 11 to 13 inches, both of them
Nice.
spotted bass in the middle of these like swells. And it was one of those moments where I never thought I would have been catching fish. I had pretty much just decided, I'm gonna take the canoe out, and while I'm out in the canoe at this point, I want to have a fishing pole with me. I might as well see if I can catch anything. And I ended up catching two fish on a day that I didn't think that I was going to, because of those surface disturbances, because I was able to manipulate that storm. And another factor that I think could be helpful for me. And so yeah, don't go out there in a monsoon, but you can use these storms kind of to your advantage. And one way that you can do that is with is with these storms kind of like clearing those boats out of the way. um I do see with like kayaking and canoeing at this point, very rarely do I go out in a canoe or a kayak without a fishing pole. I used to do it a little bit more. My first couple of years down here, I had a roommate and a couple of buddies that really liked going out canoeing and kayaking. I've got lots of stories of going up into North Georgia and doing some kayaking and canoeing, but for the most part now I want to be fishing if I'm out there.
Hmm.
So it's impeded my kayaking and canoeing, but it has greatly heightened my joy of fishing. But river kayaking and canoeing, another kind of way that water ends up playing a role is with water speed.
Mm.
You might remember the night that I ended up in the Chattahoochee, walking back and forth in that church parking lot. One of the coldest I've ever been was right after a storm, and the
Hmm.
waters were high and the waters were fast, and the waters ended up creating kind of like an undertow in one of those swells right around a rock. And those currents and those swells are kind of an aspect of kayaking that is that is quite a challenge, and so always be safe when you're out there, and it's something to always be mindful of as well. Um, uh, the water speed can be a factor, and if you don't want to end up in the water, to always be kind of mindful of that.
Yeah, so I mean, I know you mostly do a lot of lake fishing, but regarding water speed and fishing, does that play a big role? How do you have, any real guidance on that, or is it just something you don't usually deal with just based on the fact that you're doing mostly lake fishing?
That is such an interesting question, Pat. And when the we get into what I think is going to end up being our last section here, talking a little bit about kind of like the terrain and using the terrain to our advantage, I think about that frequently when it comes to real speed. And I don't mean that like REAL real speed. I mean like REEL, like the actual
Yeah.
speed of the lure, the actual speed of the reeling. And trying to match, I wonder sometimes whether I should be trying to manipulate and trying to match like a faster speed to imitate a faster current.
Mm.
And I started earlier on in this episode wanting some tips and pointers with lures for river fishing and for the Chattahoochee. The same actually kind of goes for kind of like faster lures or faster reel speeds. I've got my line set up as kind of like the standard. I kind of like set it and forget it when it comes to the reels, and I don't know the extent to which I even should be kind of like changing around my reel speed. I've seen success with what it is that I keep as kind of like my standard, but sometimes I wonder, like there are times where, especially on a lake like Lake Kiwi, that uses turbines and
Mm-hmm.
uses these like dams that sometimes are pushing up enormous volumes of water, and that ends up affecting the current of the water quite a
Yeah.
bit. I'll be on kind of like an otherwise still day, no breeze or anything like that, and you can see it as you're reeling in. There's a lack of tension sometimes as the lure is kind of like making its way back towards my kayak if they've just released, or they're drawing in water in these turbines in these dams. Like sometimes you're not reeling at all, and yet your lure is making its way back to the kayak at like an equally fast speed. It's like, what the
Yeah.
heck is going on here? Oh yeah, it's that current.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder sometimes if I might find a little bit more success if I end up using like a faster reel speed or a slower reel speed. I guess the like a true expert fisherman, maybe they have uh like a fast, a medium, and a slow kind of like reel speed that they could use in order to try and imitate the current of the water. I mean, that would really be something. It's not something
Mm-hmm.
that I've ever dipped my toe in, but I imagine for river fishing you have to,
Mm-hmm.
because if you are trying to imitate a lure or a fish, and I do so much fishing with these like fake minnows that
Mm-hmm.
it's gonna be a step out of my comfort zone to be fishing like river fishing, because I'm not sure that it's as successful as it is in a lake.
Mm-hmm.
But to try and kind of like, we're talking about things that the fish can see that are unnatural, or things that the deer can see that are unnatural. I wonder sometimes if like that speed might be something that I could kind of manipulate exactly as you're saying, in order to try and see a little bit of success there. It's not something that I've done much of, but if I do start to make my way into a little bit of river fishing, which I want to do,
Hmm.
it's going to be something that I'm gonna need to consider at least.
Yeah, definitely. I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I know sometimes I'll play. I mean, when I'm fishing, I'll mess around with lure speed, but I haven't been able to. I haven't been able to determine when it's successful and when it's not. It's really just more of the trial and error type of situation in order to see what's hitting. But yeah, so I think with this last topic I want to talk about is just how you can use the terrain to your advantage, right? So we've talked about, your elevation, things like water, things like brush. I just wanted to go over a quick story on how I kind of put all these things together on my most recent the buck that I had discussed in a couple podcasts ago, right? So in this particular area, right, I had pinpointed the fact that the deer were probably using this spot because it was a pinch between like kind of a natural slope of the hill as well as kind of like a brushy river spot, right? So we had that pinch point that was funneling that deer activity to an area where I thought there was going to be there where the deer are going to be there, right? There's also happened to be a nice scrape and a few rubs over there too, which was also adding to my confidence in the situation, right? The deer had been using that previously, and then I had this nice pinch point, which I knew was going to be funneling that deer as well. Um, as this point, like as the terrain moved out towards this marshy area, it also came to a point like within the marsh too, which was also adding. It was like kind of like a pinch point on top of a funnel, right? So it's like this double kind of pinching motion, which I really thought was gonna move the deer into that specific area. On this particular day when I got this deer, I went in. I originally went in the morning to a different spot. Didn't really have any luck there, but I had purposely planned to come to this particular area at midday, and that was because one, the way I was walking in was going to be on the south area, the south side of the hill, right? So as we discussed before, right, the south facing slopes are going to get more sun than the north side, right? What does that mean? Well, that means that that area is going to heat up faster and ultimately pull my thermals up that hill, right?
Yeah.
In addition to that, the wind was also going to shift, right? So it was shifting from a north side wind to a south side wind, right? So my plan was that between the thermals and that wind shift, I was going to be basically in a great situation as far as wind and making sure that my scent wasn't being blown to those deer. In addition, the way that I was walking into this stand was also right along a river, right? So we discussed when we were talking about the water how the river current can pull your scent down the river, and deer will sometimes stay kind of near that because they're expecting that scent to be pulling that way as well. Well, I planned that, right? I figured the deer are probably going to be setting up in a way that they're going to be able to use that water to their advantage. But because I was walking in with this particular wind shifting, as well as with the thermals in my advantage moving up the hill, I figured that even though the water was going to be quote unquote pulling my scent a little bit down, the thermals and the wind shift were going to trump that and pull my scent away, so the deer were never gonna smell me. This ultimately this meant that the deer thought that the deer had the advantage, but ultimately I had the
Yeah.
advantage moving into this spot, which was a huge benefit. Ultimately, the deer walked out using the terrain. Right, they walked through that pinch point right along the edge of that brushy area along that hill, kind of just as I had expected. And then as they were walking, they got up because that wind shifted. Right, at least that's what I anticipate. They got up because they noticed that instead of the wind coming from the north like it was in the morning, it had shifted to the south. So the wind was no longer in their advantage. They needed to move in order to put it in their advantage. And I happened to be right where I needed to be at that moment took the shot, and it was successful. So that's just kind of an example of putting all those pieces together as far as
Yeah,
terrain, thermals, the river movement, the brushy cover, and
yeah.
making it all happen. So, which is
But
why
you know,
it's no, I was just
there's almost this like euphoria to being right.
oh
And
yeah,
that's part of what I think is so awesome about this is that like you can identify this moment where you're able to put like those pieces together. And this story has a very happy ending. Well, with the wheelbarrow aspect of it, it wasn't exact. We're not gonna call it like an entirely happy ending. Although no, it was. I
it
mean, you got the
was.
carrot. I'm just teasing. But when it comes to like this has a happy ending, right?
Mm-hmm.
You were able to put those pieces together and you got the deer. At the same time, though, even if you weren't able to get the deer, it's still like you were
Mm-hmm.
right. You were able to kind
Exactly.
of like put these pieces together, and that's part of where like the strategy ends up coming in, and that's part of where the fun of this ends up coming in is being able to kind of like put the pieces together, and when you see it kind of like paying off, and this deer is going through this pinch exactly like you were expecting it
Mm-hmm.
to, trying to getting up when the wind shifts exactly as you're expecting it to. Like these are the types of things that you can that even though it's like minor victories. Now you ended up with the big victory there too. You ended up with the checkmate, right?
Yes.
You ended up with the deer. But at the same time, like there's little victories kind of like along the way. And you know, sometimes you get lucky,
Mm-hmm.
but sometimes you're able to kind of manipulate some of the terrain, which is what this episode is all about. Sometimes you're able to manipulate some of those aspects of the terrain, and it ends up with you being able to be successful in getting the deer that you are.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And ultimately I did end up getting this deer, but even before that, as soon as I saw the deer moving in the way that they were, I already had counted this as a success, right? I mean, it was the deer were doing exactly what I thought it was. At that point it's a win, and then anything else is bonus at that point, you know.
Yeah.
Ultimately it ended up happening how I wanted it to, but at the same time, just being able to see those deer moving the way I thought it was awesome and really counted as a win for me as well. So, which was
Yeah.
pretty great. But Mike, do you have any stories on being able to use some of these terrain features to your advantage?
Yeah, I got a couple. One thing that I didn't talk as much about when it comes to surface disturbances, and how you can kind of sometimes use that to your advantage, at least when you're doing the type of kayak and canoe fishing that I'm oftentimes doing, is kind of like in your approach. And you talk all the time, Pat, about your approaches into the woods and through brush and how important that is. And I think that it's almost kind of equally important in fishing, because in addition to getting your lure into the right spot at the right time in order to be able to catch a fish, you also need to not like scare the fish away with surface disturbances as you're making your way there. And so I see it going kind of both ways. If you can once again put yourself in my kayak as I'm paddling out, let's call it like 6:15 or so in the morning, when we're right at feeding time, we're right at like a perfect time when fish are going to be kind of jumping, and I'm seeing lots of sign for fish that are feeding. But I oftentimes make my way out to my point,
Hmm.
uh, while I'm trolling. And sometimes I'm tempted, as this lure is behind me, to just troll right down through the whole damn thing, and paddle my way right through as quietly as I can. But then I'm reminded that those surface disturbances that I'm making with the canoe or the kayak are going to end up scaring the fish away, and
Hmm.
they're not going to end up making their way to they're not going to end up making their way to the lure. They're going to be scared away before they can ever make it to the lure that's out behind the back of my canoe or out behind the
Hmm.
back of my kayak. And so what I've found some success doing is there's kind of like a little bit of a rim, not like that ring of fire like I was talking about in the far peninsula, but it's almost kind of like the almost like a secondary little hill, that makes this little rim around my favorite point that has like this really steep drop off. And
Hmm.
what it kind of ultimately ends up doing is doubling the places, doubling the rim of these kind of like feeding areas. One's
Hmm.
right along that hill, right at the coastline. And then there's another that's probably about 30 or 40 feet back off of the coast. You get kind of like another one of these little, or not so little actually. It goes from like 25 feet up to probably like 10,
Hmm.
5 to 10 feet, like in this kind of patch that's a little bit
Mm-hmm.
further off of the coast. And so what I've started doing is I'll end up kind of like trolling in through right across through the exterior
Mm-hmm.
of these fishing, or of these kind of like feeding hills in terms of the underwater elevation. And then once I make my way all the way to the back, there's a downed tree,
Hmm.
and then I'll start casting and retrieving my way back along the interior one. So
Okay.
I never end up truly disturbing my entire fishing ground. And so I
Ah.
can kind of like use both of them to my advantage. I end up kind of like paddling through along the crest of this one feeding ground, seeing if I can be successful. And then as I'm coming back through, now I'm casting and retrieving at the other feeding ground, to try and kind of like double my odds there. And I think it was 2 years ago, one of my first trips out, I did exactly that, and I ended up catching a fish. I ended up catching a fish on the casting and retrieving portion of that.
Hmm.
So I didn't scare them away, or at least not enough with my kind of like trolling through. It wasn't until I was casting and retrieving that I ended up catching it. And
Nice.
so that's kind of like one way that you can use surface disturbances, or rather lack thereof, in order to try and kind of like hit new areas with the lures. You always want kind of like the lure to be getting there first,
Mm-hmm.
before the kayak or the canoe gets there. And so that's kind of one way that I've used surface disturbances to my advantage. But on Lake Lanier, I've used kind of the elevation and the outward signs of elevation to my advantage quite a bit. One of these is in this like beautiful little 50 square foot plateau. It's quite small actually, and I've lost my fair share of lures in this kind of like plateau area, because I always want to use my like deeper diving ones.
Mm-hmm.
I should probably change it out and lose less lures, but I like fishing this spot. And the first time that I did, I ended up catching like two or three fish within like a 20 or 30-minute period, because I hit it right at that right time. And it was a little bit after kind of like the normal feeding time, but fish that are hungry are going to find a place where they're able to use the elevation to their advantage.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what I ended up doing, is I used this kind of like plateau, and it's the one that I can see from kind of like my parking spot. So as I'm coming in, I can always see whether that plateau is taken, and I want to get there early enough that I can kind of like that I can use it to my advantage. But for some reason, it's been better for me at like that 9, 10 o'clock hour,
Hmm.
to kind of like go fishing elsewhere and kind of like make my way back. I don't know why, but I've been able to, maybe the less volume of water, maybe it's a little bit warmer, and so
Yeah,
there's
that's what
maybe a
I
little
was
bit more
thinking
fish
too. I wonder.
activity.
I wonder if that water warms up because it's because of the sun, and a little bit shallower, and that's why the fish are over there at that time.
And so it's kind of like a little like plateau of like a feeding frenzy.
Hmm.
And so for whatever reason, maybe it is the water temperature, but I've seen some success there, catching some fish. That the first time I fished that plateau, I caught three fish. I'm pretty
Oh,
sure
nice.
within like 30 minutes. And so that's I'll take those. I'll take that ratio every day, if you'll give it to me. But the other place, like right around the bend from there, there's it's almost kind of like this valley, and you can see from either end of it, might be 150 yards. No, it's less than that. It's probably closer to like 100 yards across, between these two like decently steep exterior, I'll call it exterior, kind of like coastal drop offs.
Hmm.
And so they both come down like relatively steep. And so if you kind of like continue that line from where it is that these hills essentially are kind of like meeting, they only just get to the bottom of this valley before they start making their way back up the other side.
Hmm.
And so if you look at that in terms of feeding with these fish, in terms of the elevation with what it is that I'm seeing, if I take my kayak and I kind of like go right down one stretch and right back up the other,
Hmm.
I get to cover two different feeding areas, that very likely have fish that are trying to funnel their prey, that are trying to funnel these other fish into kind of that lower elevation, into that lower depth.
Mm.
And so if or higher depth, I guess. And so if and I thought to myself the first time that I fished that area, if I can kind of like go right down one side and right up the other with my lure, there's a chance that I might be able to catch a fish. And that's exactly what I ended up doing. I made my way right down one end, and as I was coming up on the other side of this feeding area, I ended up catching a fish. And it was a good sized fish too. It was probably like 10 inches or so. And I reeled it in, and I was thrilled that I was able to catch the fish. I turned my kayak around and I started paddling back the other way. And on that same exact slope, now not on the upward side, but now on the downward side, as I was
Hmm.
coming across, I caught another fish as I was coming back on through that same fishing area. It wasn't the same fish. This one was probably maybe an inch or so bigger. It was a little bit bigger, the
Nice.
second fish that I ended up catching, and he put up a fight. But as I was coming back down, it was the exact same area. I was able to use that elevation to my advantage with what it was that I was seeing on the outside, the signs. In the example of the plateau, they've got signs, literal signs, like posted all over the place, letting us know that it's a very shallow area. So I was able to use those signs to my advantage. But then I was able to use the kind of the elevation signs with those drop offs to my advantage to be able to catch two fish on kind of like a spot right around the corner there. So those are my Lake Lanier stories with how I've been able to use some of that to my advantage.
Nice. Well, Mike, I think we've done quite an extensive deep dive into terrain here. I think
Yep.
this has been a really, really good conversation on some of these aspects, some of the ways that we utilize the terrain, and can take advantage of some of that as we move into some of our hunting and fishing expeditions here. Any last points before we call this one?
No, I just want to say I'm kind of laughing to myself over here as you're saying that we did a deep dive into this topic. Pat, whatever it is that we put down on these sheets, and if you're listening at home, we have these shared Google Docs that we kind of like fill with these different topics and everything. And that, Pat, regardless of what the topic is, we always do a deep dive,
It's
and
true.
that's part of what I love about this is that we're able to kind of like, it's there's something about doing like a deep dive in like a really close reading of literature. And I'm listening to a couple of podcasts or one podcast in particular right now that's doing like such a deep dive into literature, and I love that. And I love that kind of like aspect of the close reading. It's something that I like basically do for a living as an 11th grade and as an 8th grade English teacher. But we're doing essentially kind of like the same thing here. It's like close reading and close attention to detail when it comes to something as specific as the terrain. And that's what I love about this is that, Pat, whatever it is that we put down on this sheet, we're going to do a deep dive into it, and we're going to have some fun, and we're going to be able to share some stories. And in this episode, we did exactly that. So it's time well spent as far as I'm concerned.
Great. Yeah, no, totally agree. Lots of fun here and really good conversation. But yeah, I think we're gonna have to call this one. We've been talking for a while here, so I think it's about time to wrap it up. So don't forget to rate and review. And until next time, get outside, have some fun out there. Thanks for listening to the East Coast Hunt, Fish, Hike podcast. If you have questions, comments, or have an idea for an episode, feel free to follow us and reach out over social media. Don't forget to rate, review, or tell your friends about the podcast. And until you hear from us again, get outside, have some fun out there.